China might not be a member of the G7, but it is set to dominate discussions as leaders of some of the world's richest nations gather for their first meeting in 2 years. The G7 wants to lead the world out of the pandemic, starting with an ambitious plan to vaccinate the global population within 2 years.
Tight security in Cornwall as leaders of the world's wealthiest countries meet for the first time since the pandemic. They are set to agree on donating 1 billion COVID-19 vaccine doses to poorer nations. Half will come from the U.S., which has pledged 500 million Pfizer shots, while Britain has committed 100 million surplus vaccines.
What we're doing is joining up with the US and the other G7 members, leading by example with our 100 millions, but the aim is to get the world vaccinated by the end of 2022. If we can do that, we'll be making a real step forward in dealing with the pandemic globally.
But China is also on world leaders' minds. U.S. President Joe Biden is expected to try and convince allies to join him in taking a tougher stance towards Beijing over its actions in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and the South China Sea. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has extended an invitation to the G7 summit to other countries, including India, Australia, and South Korea. He wants to propose an expanded alliance of democratic nations, or what he calls the D10, to counter China.
Ollie Barrett joins us from Cornwall. Ollie, as G7 leaders will have to manage a tough balancing act when it comes to China.
That's exactly right. The G7 leaders here do want to show that democracies can come together and show unity and strength. But there's also a question about exactly what they want to do when it comes to Russia and China, and exactly how to respond to some of the perceived aggression that the G7 nations feel. It is significant as well that the guests of the G7 invited by Britain include South Korea and Australia. We have South Africa coming too. That is an attempt to try and increase the power that a grouping of democratic countries can portray. But as I say, the real question is about exactly whether concerted responses in any way can come up. And there are also some divisions to be aware of too. There is a growing sense that Joe Biden, the US president, feels that the British are roughly aligned with his position when it comes to China and the stance to take, but may feel that some European countries don't quite come along as far down that route as the UK and Britain are currently heading with regards to sanctions and actions against companies like Huawei, for example. So it is a difficult balancing strike for G7 countries difficult balancing act for G7 countries to strike here.
Ollie, leaders are expected to pledge 1 billion vaccines for the world's poorest countries, but some say that's not enough.
That's right. We've had that pledge from the United States of 500 million doses of the Pfizer vaccine, but some are looking at that and saying, well, quite a lot of that appears to be quite far off into the distance in terms of when those doses actually arrive. The UK has already come out with that pledge of 100 million surplus doses to donate to the rest of the world. The same criticism is being levelled at Britain in that regard, although it does say that 5 million of those doses will be going out by September, and that will start in the coming weeks. But the World Health Organization is saying you probably need 11 billion doses or so in total if we're going to get the world to some kind of herd immunity threshold. So there still does remain a major shortfall. That target of 1 billion you would think would be reasonably easy for the G7 countries to meet over the course of this weekend, and then attention will focus on exactly how quickly they can get those jabs dispersed around the world to the countries that need it the most.
And Ollie, this is the first meeting since the pandemic. What measures are in place to ensure that everyone manages to stay safe?
Well, there have been rigorous measures in place before the delegations even arrived at this summit. The key leaders and their closest teams do have to make sure that they're tested before arrival, and they get tested when they're here as well. And there are some social distancing measures in place. But their wider delegations, if they've flown in from abroad, do have to actually isolate when they've arrived here. So we have seen quite a lot of diplomatic officials coming into the UK a couple of weeks in advance of this summit, so they can go through that isolation process that would be applied to any other travellers coming in from abroad. India, for example, is attending virtually, and the reason for that is that at the G7 foreign ministers meeting recently in London, there was that testing positive that we saw in the Indian delegation that meant that it had to carry out the rest of that summit virtually as well, deciding this time around to stay in India and attend these meetings virtually. The UK does want to show that face-to-face diplomacy can now get going again, and it's very keen to show that it can handle this without any major outbreaks at the summit itself. So we will clearly need to get to Sunday before we know whether that has actually been possible.
All right, many thanks for that. Ollie Barrett speaking to us from Cornwall.